What happens when a woman's voice becomes so powerful that men fear it more than armies? That is the question hanging over every forgotten poetess whose words spread too far, too boldly, too truthfully. In the ancient world, when a woman spoke through poetry, she wasn't simply expressing emotion. She was committing an act of defiance. Her verses could expose corruption, undermine authority, reveal hidden brutality, or challenge the myths that kept entire societies obedient. And because of that, the men in power often responded with something far darker than censorship. They responded with revenge. Across ancient kingdoms, from rigid patriarchal city-states to sprawling imperial courts, there are stories of poetesses whose punishment went far beyond silencing. Their voices weren't just restricted, they were hunted. Their reputations were dismantled piece by piece, their families threatened, their works burned, their bodies punished with cruelty meant to send a message. The danger wasn't the poem itself. The danger was that a woman dared to speak at all. Imagine a society where a single metaphor could be seen as rebellion, where a carefully crafted verse was treated like a political attack, where a line about injustice could destabilize a man who believed the world revolved around his authority. That was the reality for these women. Their poetry held mirrors to the powerful, and the powerful retaliated with vengeance disguised as morality, tradition, or divine will. Some were accused of impurity to ruin their credibility. Others were forced into exile so their words would vanish with them. A few suffered reprisals so brutal they were erased almost entirely from the historical record. But if history tried to bury these stories, fragments still remain. Scattered references, hostile accounts written by their enemies, echoing lines preserved by accident rather than intention. Those fragments reveal a pattern. The louder a poetess's truth rang, the more vicious the retaliation became. And the cruelty wasn't random. It was calculated, methodical, personal. These men weren't punishing crimes. They were avenging bruised egos. As you listen to this, think about the sheer force required for a woman to write in a world built to silence her. Think about the risk behind every line she composed. And think about why some men felt the need to destroy not just her work, but her as a warning to every woman who might dare to follow. Before we continue, tell me something. Have you ever witnessed someone punished simply for telling an uncomfortable truth? Your perspective matters here, so leave a comment sharing your reaction to this opening. And while you're here, make sure to like the video and check whether you're already subscribed, because the story that unfolds from this point will only get more unsettling as we follow how these voices were hunted, erased, and yet somehow refused to die. The fear surrounding women who wrote in the ancient world wasn't abstract. It was immediate, visceral, and deeply political. A poetess with a sharp mind and a sharper tongue could unravel the illusion of male authority with nothing but ink and a steady hand. Her verses could travel faster than decrees, survive longer than laws, and expose truths that rulers spent lifetimes trying to conceal. That is why their words were treated as threats, not contributions. And that is why the retaliation against them was always personal. In societies built on rigid hierarchies, a woman who mastered language could move between social layers in ways men never anticipated. Her poetry slipped into private gatherings, echoed in temple courtyards, crossed city walls through traders and storytellers. She became a voice that men could not fully control, a presence that existed outside the structures designed to contain her. And the men who feared instability understood exactly what that meant. If a woman could influence minds without permission, she could influence power without permission. That was intolerable. So the system responded with the oldest weapon it had: reputation warfare. Before physical punishment came character assassination. A poetess who questioned injustice could be labeled immoral, unfeminine, dangerous, corrupting to youth, or even possessed. These accusations didn't need evidence. They only needed repetition. By turning her public image into a scandal, her enemies weakened the impact of her words before the public even heard them. A poem becomes less threatening, after all, when its author has been branded a disgrace. But silencing a voice was never enough when a poetess struck directly at a man's pride. Some rulers took the attack personally, interpreting a metaphor as a challenge, a satirical verse as insubordination, a romantic poem as rejection. That's when retaliation crossed into cruelty. Public humiliation became a tool of control. Accusations of impropriety were crafted with precision. A poetess could be forced to confess to crimes she never committed, placed under surveillance, pressured into isolation, or stripped of patronage that sustained her work. Every step was designed to remind her that her talent did not exempt her from punishment. What makes these stories so disturbing is that the danger wasn't tied to political shape-shifting or secret manipulation. Many poetesses were not plotting against kings or challenging institutions directly. Their crime was simpler. They articulated human experience without asking permission. Their emotions were too vivid. Their criticism was too clear. Their independence was too visible. And for societies terrified of women who understood themselves, this alone was an act of rebellion. The result was a quiet war fought in homes, courts, markets, temples, and royal chambers. A war where the weapon was the written word, and the counterattack was the crushing of the women who dared to wield it. Some were exiled under the guise of protecting societal harmony. Others were forced into marriages meant to suffocate their creativity. A few watched their manuscripts destroyed by the very people who once praised them. And all of them learned that a woman who speaks too boldly will always be seen as someone who must be controlled. This was the environment that shaped the cruelest personal revenges in history, a world where a poem could provoke more fury than a rebellion, and where the men threatened by female intellect would do anything to ensure her words never outlived their authority. Among the countless women whose voices were buried by time, there is one figure whose story survives only in fragments, a poetess celebrated during her lifetime and then annihilated so thoroughly that even her name was nearly erased. What remains of her legacy comes from hostile accounts, scattered references in rival manuscripts, and a few surviving verses copied by scribes who admired her talent, but feared the consequences of preserving her work. Her disappearance wasn't the result of war, famine, or accidental loss. It was deliberate. And the cruelty behind it exposes just how far those in power were willing to go when a woman's words cut too deeply. She lived in a city that prided itself on culture and refinement, a place where poets were honored with festivals, inscriptions, and public readings. For a time, she thrived there. Her verses circulated among scholars, aristocrats, and even members of the ruling council. She wrote about injustice with striking clarity, and she wrote about desire in a way that unsettled men who believed feminine expression should be confined to whispers. Her growing influence drew admiration from the public, but it also provoked resentment from men threatened by her mastery of language. They saw not a poet, but a disruption. The spark that ignited her downfall was a single poem, a piece that criticized a powerful official known for corruption. The poem was sharp, unmistakable in its target, and it spread quickly. Citizens recited it in marketplaces. Students copied it into their learning tablets. Performers adapted it into street songs that echoed through the city at night. The official's name was never mentioned, but everyone recognized the portrait painted between the lines. And for a man whose authority depended on fear, the embarrassment was intolerable. He used his position to destroy her life with the efficiency of a bureaucratic execution. Publicly, he claimed she had violated moral codes. Privately, he orchestrated a campaign to dismantle her identity. Her allies were pressured to withdraw support. Her patrons were threatened with sanctions. Her manuscripts were confiscated under the pretext of maintaining public order. The official then convened a tribunal, not to prosecute a crime, but to force her into silence. What happened next reveals the darkest aspect of revenge disguised as justice. She was condemned not through evidence, but through insinuation. Witnesses were coerced, records were altered. The accusation that sealed her fate claimed her poetry incited disorder, a vague charge that allowed her enemies to punish her without admitting their personal motives. She was stripped of her civic status, forbidden from teaching, and banished from the city she once enriched with her talent. Her works were burned in a symbolic act meant to erase both her influence and her defiance. But the cruelty didn't end with exile. The city that once celebrated her rewrote its own memory. Her name was removed from festival lists. Her verses were attributed to male poets. Her contributions were replaced with narratives that painted her as arrogant, immoral, or unstable. In the official histories, she became a cautionary tale rather than a cultural figure, a woman whose ambition disrupted harmony. For her enemies, this was the perfect victory. She was alive, yet invisible. What survives of her today are only tiny shards, a fragment of a love poem preserved in a foreign archive, a hostile critique written decades later, a half-erased inscription uncovered during excavation. Each small remnant points to a larger truth. The violence done to her was not a single act, but a systematic attempt to erase her from the world she challenged. Her story is the blueprint for how a woman's legacy could be dismantled when her voice bruised the ego of a man who wielded power like a weapon. Revenge becomes most dangerous when it hides behind the mask of public morality, and nowhere is that clearer than in the story of a poetess targeted not for sedition, not for blasphemy, but for embarrassing the wrong man. Her punishment was framed as a civic necessity, but every detail reveals a personal vendetta carried out with surgical precision. She had risen to prominence through her performances, drawing enormous crowds who admired her ability to expose hypocrisy with elegantly constructed satire. Her verses circulated far beyond elite circles, reaching people who rarely had access to art or education. That alone unsettled the city's rulers. A woman who could influence the masses was an anomaly they didn't know how to control. The man who orchestrated her downfall was a magistrate known for ruthless ambition. He tolerated criticism from men, even harsh criticism, because challenging him was seen as a game of politics. But ridicule coming from a woman was an entirely different matter. One poem in particular struck at his pride, not by naming him outright, but by describing an official whose authority collapsed the moment people stopped fearing him. The imagery was too recognizable for anyone to miss. The poem spread quickly, and the magistrate's opponents weaponized it in debates, repeating lines with thinly veiled amusement. He knew the author could only be silenced if he transformed her talent into a liability. He began with subtle intimidation. Audits of her patrons, rumors quietly seeded among conservative scholars, accusations whispered at private gatherings. When none of that dampened her influence, he escalated. He summoned her to a hearing, claiming she had violated ceremonial codes during a public reading. The law in question was obscure, centuries old, and rarely enforced. Yet he used it as the legal framework to attack her. She defended herself eloquently, exposing contradictions in the charges, but that only deepened his resentment. Every word she spoke reminded him that she could outthink him in front of witnesses. Unable to defeat her through argument, he engineered a more insidious punishment. He declared her poetry a destabilizing force and assigned censors to review her work. The censors were chosen specifically for their loyalty to him, men who viewed female intellect as an inherent threat. They scrutinized her metaphors, reinterpreting them as coded political messages. Suddenly, her artistic choices were treated as evidence of subversion. The magistrate then announced that she would undergo a public moral examination, an event staged not for justice, but for humiliation. Officials interrogated her in front of a hostile audience, demanding explanations for symbolic passages she had written years earlier. When she refused to confess to offenses she hadn't committed, he delivered the final blow. She was sentenced to ritualized disgrace, prohibited from performing, stripped of her public platform, and forced to stand before the city while scribes read. Distorted interpretations of her work meant to shame her. The spectacle made her the target of mockery, orchestrated by the very man whose pride she had wounded. The punishment was designed to break her spirit without shedding blood, ensuring that her silence appeared voluntary rather than coerced. What makes this act of revenge so brutal is not the severity of the punishment, but the precision with which it was tailored to destroy her identity. Her talent became the tool used against her. Her reputation was twisted into a public warning, and the magistrate's personal humiliation was recast as a moral victory for the city. His cruelty was disguised as civic duty, erasing the true motive behind every step taken against her. If you've reached this point, tell me, which part of this story struck you the hardest? Leave your thoughts in the comments. There are moments in history when a single poem becomes more dangerous than a weapon, and the story of this poetess proves exactly that. She lived in a courtly environment where literature circulated through private salons, elite gatherings, and intellectual circles dominated by men who viewed themselves as the arbiters of taste. Her poetry was admired for its clarity, its emotional precision, and its willingness to address subjects that most writers avoided. But admiration turned to hostility when one of her verses exposed a truth that a powerful man had spent years concealing. The man she crossed was not a ruler, but something far more volatile, a court favorite, elevated by patronage rather than merit, whose position depended entirely on maintaining the illusion of competence. His influence came from proximity to power, not from achievements, and that made him hypersensitive to criticism. When her poem circulated, those who knew him instantly recognized the veiled portrait. She described a man who rose by flattery, who borrowed authority he did not own, who crumbled whenever challenged. It was not a direct accusation, but the resemblance was undeniable. And once people began whispering the comparison, the damage was irreversible. His response was as swift as it was vindictive. He began collecting information, fragments of gossip, old disagreements, exaggerated anecdotes, building a narrative he could weaponize. He presented himself as a victim of an unprovoked attack, claiming the poetess had orchestrated a slander campaign. His allies, eager to protect their own positions, supported him without question. They framed her poem not as art, but as a calculated attempt to undermine the stability of the court. Every metaphor she wrote was dissected, twisted into evidence of malicious intent. Men who had once praised her talent now turned on her, eager to align themselves with the rising tide. As the pressure mounted, she found herself isolated. Invitations to gatherings stopped arriving. Her patrons distanced themselves under the guise of political caution. Even those who believed in her integrity remained silent, unwilling to risk their own reputations for a woman increasingly framed as a disruptive force. The court favorite then enacted the final stage of his revenge. He petitioned the council to investigate her for moral misconduct, a vague charge that allowed endless interpretation. The council agreed, not because they believed she had done anything wrong, but because they feared the consequences of opposing him. The investigation was a performance, staged to justify a verdict, predetermined from the beginning. Witnesses were coached to reinterpret her behavior through a lens of impropriety. Innocent gestures became signs of arrogance. Private conversations were distorted into accusations of manipulation. The council concluded that her influence posed a threat to decorum, a phrase that allowed them to punish her without stating a specific offense. She was expelled from courtly life, denied access to the circles that had sustained her career, and ordered to surrender. Her manuscripts for review. What happened next sealed her fate. The court favorite ensured that her surviving work was selectively circulated with annotations that undermined her credibility. Her poems were preserved, but only in fragments, each accompanied by commentary suggesting she was unstable, vindictive, or morally suspect. Her voice was not erased, but corrupted, turned into a cautionary example for other women who might attempt to critique a man who believed himself untouchable. Brilliance of her writing was overshadowed by the narrative imposed upon it, a narrative crafted by someone who feared the power of an honest line more than any political rival. Her revenge story reveals how easily one man's wounded pride could reshape an entire historical record, transforming a gifted poetess into a distorted memory that served the ambitions of those who sought to silence her. The violence inflicted on poetesses was never just the result of wounded pride or impulsive retaliation. It emerged from a deeper fear rooted in the structures of ancient power, the terror of a woman who understood language too well. A poem could travel where soldiers could not. It could pierce reputations, destabilize alliances, and expose buried truths with nothing more than carefully chosen words. Men who ruled through intimidation understood this instinctively. They knew that controlling women's voices was essential to maintaining the fragile order they built around themselves. And when a poetess refused to yield, their fear often erupted into extraordinary brutality. One of the clearest examples began with a poem that was never meant to be political at all. It was a lament, raw, intimate, and painfully honest, written by a woman grieving the disappearance of her sister, likely taken as collateral in a negotiation between rival factions. The poem described corruption not as an institution, but as a living force devouring the weak. She wrote about deals made at night, about men who could trade lives without consequence, about a world where suffering was currency. She never named names, but the metaphor was unmistakable. Anyone who held power recognized themselves in her words. The ruling council saw the poem as a threat because it gained momentum faster than they could contain it. Women repeated the lines as quiet protests in marketplaces. Elders recited them during meals. Even children adapted its imagery into street songs. Her grief had turned into a collective indictment, and the men who felt exposed responded with precision. They summoned her under the guise of clarifying the poem's intent, a procedure usually reserved for writers accused of sedition. She attended willingly, believing her sincerity would protect her, unaware that the outcome had already been decided. Inside the council chamber, the atmosphere shifted immediately. Her words were twisted into insinuations of conspiracy. Her metaphors were treated as coded messages. They accused her of encouraging civil unrest, claiming her poem fueled dissatisfaction among the lower classes. She attempted to explain the personal nature of her writing, but every sentence was interrupted, dissected, or reinterpreted with hostility. The more she defended herself, the more they insisted she was defiant. Her mere willingness to speak became proof of guilt. When they realized they couldn't break her intellectually, they turned to public humiliation. They forced her to stand in a crowded square while officials read a distorted version of her poem, deliberately misrepresenting its tone and meaning. They claimed she wrote it to undermine authority, to incite rebellion, to shame the city. The crowd watched as she was condemned not for wrongdoing, but for refusing to surrender her grief to political convenience. The council then imposed restrictions designed to suffocate her voice. She was forbidden from teaching, from performing, from circulating her work in any form. But the most chilling element of the council's retaliation was what they did to her words. They commissioned new poets, men loyal to the ruling faction, to produce verses that countered her message. These responses framed her lament as exaggerated, irrational, and unfit for public discourse. Over time, their versions replaced hers in public memory. Her poems survived only in fragments, preserved by admirers who hid scraps of parchment in walls, in chests, in burial goods. The contrast between her fragile surviving lines and the council's polished condemnations reveals the depth of their fear. They understood her authenticity in a way they never understood their own authority. The violence she endured illustrates the core truth of these stories. The male-controlled systems of the ancient world weren't threatened by rebellion. They were threatened by clarity, by a woman who saw the world as it was and dared to say so in a way others could not ignore. Nothing reveals the cruelty of ancient power more clearly than the moment a personal vendetta becomes state doctrine. This is what happened to a poetess whose punishment transformed from one man's revenge into an official policy designed to terrify every woman who dared to speak. Her story begins with a simple act of defiance. She refused to alter a poem that exposed a governor's hypocrisy. The poem spread quickly, carried by merchants and travelers, gaining an audience far beyond the city where it was written. What began as a personal insult to a powerful man soon became a symbol of resistance among women who recognized their own frustrations in her words. The governor's initial outrage was predictable: public complaints, demands for retraction, covert pressure on her patrons. But as the poem gained traction, his anger hardened into obsession. He convinced the ruling council that her words posed a threat to civic order, weaving a narrative that framed her creativity as rebellion. The council agreed not because they believed him, but because they feared the consequences of opposing someone who wielded such influence. And so they authorized a series of measures intended not only to punish her, but to send a message to all women watching. Her public readings were outlawed. The scribes who had copied her work were interrogated. Anyone found possessing her verses risked fines or imprisonment. But the most chilling order was the one directed at her personally. She was to undergo a purification procession, i.e., ritual humiliation used only in the most severe moral accusations. She was paraded through the streets, surrounded by guards, forced to walk past jeering spectators as officials recited distorted interpretations of her poems. The goal was to redefine her identity in the eyes of the public, not as a talented writer, but as an example of feminine rebellion crushed by righteous authority. Yet the governor wasn't satisfied. He petitioned for an edict requiring all women who engaged in public artistic expression to register with magistrates, submitting their work for approval before sharing it. The council approved it, and overnight her punishment became a precedent. Women feared that a single metaphor, a single line, could be construed as defiance. The atmosphere shifted from cautious creativity to suffocating silence. Her personal torment had metastasized into policy. Meanwhile, she was sent into internal exile, confined to a remote religious compound where she was forbidden from writing or teaching. But even there, her influence persisted. Young novices whispered her banned lines during evening rituals. Travelers smuggled fragments of her poems into the compound, wrapping them in cloth to avoid detection. Her words had become contraband, dangerous, forbidden, and more powerful than ever. Historians later noted that the edict remained in effect long after the governor died, cementing her punishment into the legal structure of the region. Generations of women grew up under regulations rooted in her humiliation. Her suffering outlived her not because of the poem she wrote, but because of the fear it awakened in the men who ruled. A fear so deep they turned one act of revenge into a weapon of governance. This is the terrifying truth behind her story. The system didn't merely punish her. It used her as the foundation for suppressing every woman who might follow her path. Her life became the cautionary tale they needed to enforce silence. Which part of this account struck you most? Share your thoughts in the comments. Some revenge stories end in death, but others end in something far more haunting: survival stripped of self. The poetess at the center of this account lived through her punishment, yet what remained of her was a hollowed version of the woman she once was, a living reminder of what happens when a powerful man decides that destroying a voice is not enough. He wanted to destroy the meaning behind it. She had been known for her fierce independence, her ability to articulate emotions with a clarity that unsettled the men who governed her city. Her verses traveled through taverns, temples, and private salons, carried by those who felt seen by her words. But the official whose authority she unintentionally challenged saw her talent as a liability that had to be neutralized. Her downfall began with a poem that blended personal longing and political critique. She had not aimed the poem at anyone in particular, but the official interpreted it as a direct accusation against his administration. Instead of confronting her openly, he employed a quieter form of retaliation: social suffocation. Influential citizens were instructed to stop inviting her to gatherings. Scribes were pressured not to copy her work. Merchants who supported her patronage were audited. Little by little, the world she belonged to vanished beneath her feet. Once she was isolated, he initiated the next phase: intellectual erasure. He commissioned rival poets, men desperate for favor, to produce works that contradicted her themes. Their verses mocked her metaphors, belittled her emotional insight, twisted her imagery into proof of instability. When these poems circulated, they carried the implicit message that she was unreliable, overly dramatic, or incapable of grasping the political realities she dared to critique. Her own work, once praised for its emotional accuracy, became ammunition against her. But the most devastating blow came when the official invoked a law rarely enforced, a regulation allowing authorities to temporarily detain individuals whose writings endanger civic harmony. She was taken without ceremony to a remote estate controlled by the government. The estate was not a prison in the traditional sense. There were no chains, no cells, but it was designed to break the mind rather than the body. She was required to perform menial labor from sunrise to dusk. She was forbidden from speaking with visitors. She was monitored by attendants who recorded her every action. Any attempt to write, even to carve a symbol into wood, was met with confiscation and punishment. Over time, her sense of identity deteriorated. She no longer spoke in the lyrical cadences that once defined her. The metaphors that had flowed effortlessly from her mind grew faint, as if her creative instinct had been buried under layers of exhaustion. Travelers who later claimed to have seen her described a woman who seemed present but distant, her gaze unfocused, her voice flat. They said she hummed fragments of poems she could no longer remember, lines that faded before they reached her lips. When the official finally deemed her no longer a threat, she was released back into society. But her return was not a triumph. She had become a ghost wandering through streets that once celebrated her. People recognized her face but avoided her presence, unsure whether speaking to her would draw unwanted scrutiny. Her former students approached her with hesitation, offering greetings she struggled to reciprocate. The man who orchestrated her downfall had achieved his goal. He had not only silenced her, but reshaped her into a living warning. Her existence served as a reminder that a woman's brilliance could be turned against her, that creativity could be weaponized by those who feared its power. In the end, she survived in the physical sense, but the symbolic death she endured was far more chilling. Her voice had not been extinguished by execution, exile, or torture. It had been dissolved slowly, through isolation, humiliation, and psychological attrition. And perhaps that is why her story lingers. She became a monument to the kind of cruelty that leaves no visible scars, yet fractures everything beneath the surface. The aftermath of these personal revenges did not end with the women who suffered them. Their silence reshaped the world around them, leaving consequences that stretched across generations. What happened to a single poetess became a lesson, sometimes whispered, sometimes enforced, about the dangers of female expression. The violence inflicted upon them carved invisible boundaries into the cultural landscape, boundaries that discipline not only women, but entire societies. To understand how deeply these punishments resonated, you have to look at what happened after the poetesses were erased, humiliated, exiled, or broken. In the cities where these events occurred, public memory adjusted, quickly, almost instinctively, to align with the interests of powerful men. Stories of the poetesses were retold in increasingly distorted forms, reducing them from influential writers to troublesome figures whose fates were portrayed as inevitable. Their brilliance became warning signs rather than achievements, and because official records rarely contradicted the ruling class, these altered narratives became the accepted truth. A woman who once shaped conversations through metaphor and insight was now remembered as reckless, foolish, or dangerously outspoken. This shift in cultural memory had profound effects. Younger women who might have pursued writing or public expression learned to suppress their voices. Some did so out of fear, others out of resignation, and others because their families taught them that a woman's safety depended on silence. Even those who dared to write adopted strategies of self-protection, hiding political critique behind coded imagery, circulating work anonymously, or confining their poetry to domestic spaces. The world did not forbid women to think, but it made clear that thinking publicly carried a cost. Men, too, absorbed the unspoken lesson. They learned that female intellect could be contained through reputation, accusation, or legal manipulation. They saw how easily a woman's work could be discredited, how swiftly society turned against her when pressured by authority. This created an imbalance that stretched far beyond poetry. It influenced legal practices, social customs, and educational opportunities. A woman's brilliance was not denied outright. It was framed as dangerous if directed beyond the boundaries men had constructed. What makes these consequences particularly insidious is that they were not always enforced through violence. Often, they were maintained through subtle shifts: the exclusion of women from literary gatherings, the refusal to teach them advanced rhetoric, the assumption that their emotional insight was a liability rather than a gift. The punishments inflicted on poetesses became stories retold in families, shaping the behavior of daughters and sons long after the original events were forgotten. Fear became tradition. Yet the suppression produced an unintended effect as well. In private spaces, in underground circles, in moments far removed from public scrutiny, fragments of the banned poetess's work survived. Women shared lines with one another during chores, inscribing verses, inside personal objects, embedding metaphors into songs, preserving what the authorities tried to erase. Their words became part of a collective memory, fragile, shifting, but persistent. And though these fragments rarely reached the public sphere, they offered something vital: the reassurance that resistance had existed, that women before them had spoken boldly even when the world punished them for it. The long-term consequence of these revenges was not simply the erasure of individual poetesses, but the construction of a cultural framework that defined female creativity as inherently dangerous. The cost of speaking became a generational inheritance, shaping not only who wrote, but who felt permitted to imagine themselves as creators. And even now, centuries later, the echoes of that fear can be traced through the historical gaps where women's voices should have been. The final revenge in this series reveals the most unsettling truth of all: that attempts to destroy AI, poetess's voice often failed not because her enemies relented, but because the power of her words exceeded the limits of her era. This woman lived in a society that considered female intellect dangerous, yet she wrote with a boldness that made silence impossible. Her verses spread through back rooms, market stalls, private readings, and gatherings where women shared their inner worlds beyond the reach of authority. What made her especially threatening was not simply the content of her work, but the loyalty it inspired. Her audience found in her poetry a clarity that exposed hypocrisies the ruling class had built their authority upon. The man who sought revenge on her was a high-ranking advisor, someone whose influence depended on public perception. He prided himself on being a voice of reason, a guardian of social order. But her work illuminated how often that order served only to protect powerful men from scrutiny. She described, with precise and unyielding metaphor, the way institutions disguised cruelty beneath layers of ritual and tradition. Her poem circulated without her name attached, but the advisor recognized her voice instantly. It was a voice that had challenged him before, one he had dismissed publicly, yet feared privately. Instead of confronting her directly, he orchestrated a plan to dismantle her legacy through erasure disguised as preservation. He commissioned a scholarly review of her work, assembling a panel of men who had long resented her influence. Their task was not to evaluate her poetry, but to rewrite its meaning. They reframed her metaphors as emotional volatility, her critiques as misunderstandings, her courage as naive rebellion. When the edited collection was released, it bore her name but not her truth. Her most incisive lines were softened or replaced. Her biting commentary on injustice was repositioned as moral commentary affirming the very structures she sought to challenge. Yet even this was not enough for the advisor. He knew that as long as the real versions of her poems existed, they could resurface. So he issued a decree requiring all original manuscripts to be surrendered for archival preservation. In reality, the manuscripts were destroyed. She was forced to watch the flames consuming the pages she had crafted over a lifetime, pages that held the fullness of her identity. The advisor believed that by controlling the record, he could control memory itself. But memory proved far more resilient than he expected. Her students, admirers, and confidants had long anticipated such a retaliation. Many had concealed copies of her work, some written on fabric, others hidden inside family heirlooms or carved faintly into wood. These fragments survived the purge, circulating quietly until they reached distant regions where her enemies held no power. Over generations, those fragments expanded into legend. Her erased lines became symbols of defiance. The advisor's polished revisions were forgotten, while her authentic voice endured in the spaces where authority could not reach. And this is the final revelation. Every act of revenge meant to silence a poetess ultimately amplified the threat she posed. The violence inflicted upon her became part of her legacy, not an erasure of it. Her story reminds us that those in power fear not the poem itself, but the possibility that truth can outlive them. A single verse, carried by those who refuse to forget, can dismantle a reputation built on fear. A fragment preserved in secret can expose an entire system's fragility. If you stayed with this story until now, it means the voices these women fought to protect still matter to you. Before you move to the next chapter of this journey, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Leave a comment with the phrase, "I'm here until the end," so I know their stories reached you. And if this video resonated, give it a like. Your engagement keeps these forgotten histories from disappearing again. When you're ready to continue, there's another video waiting that deepens this exploration. Click it and come with me. There's more hidden truth ahead.